in Acts chapter 6, we see the reality of this new Christian community. It says in verse 1, as the believers rapidly multiplied, there were rumblings of discontent. Doesn't that always happen in the church, right? The Greek-speaking believers, they were still Jewish, but they spoke Greek, complained about the Hebrew-speaking believers, saying that their widows were being discriminated against in the daily distribution of food. So we see that even the early church wasn't perfect, right? It wasn't just Ananias and Sapphira that were imperfect. There are some squabbles now in the early church, and here we see what they do about it. So the 12 called a meeting of the believers, and they talked about it, and I'll let you read that for yourself. But in the end, they basically just appointed, basically deacons over that particular ministry that needed to come up now because of this church as it continued to grow. And so problem solved. Verse 7 says, so now that problem was solved, God's message continued to spread, and the number of believers greatly increased in Jerusalem, and many of the Jewish priests were converted too. So the early church at this point isn't just regular Jewish people that attended synagogue, but it was also now even some of the Jewish priests, which is fantastic, right? And then we see this story here. Stephen is arrested. Stephen was a man full of God's grace and power, and he performed miraculous signs and wonders among the people, but we see that he's going to kind of run into some opposition. So some people persuaded some men to lie about Stephen, and they said, hey, we heard him blaspheme Moses and even God. And so the people were roused, the elders and the teachers of the religious law, so they arrested Stephen, and they brought him before the high council. Now, this was the first time we saw someone who's not an apostle, so now it's Stephen being brought before the high council. Now, the lying witness bore false testimony, which, by the way, is against the Ten Commandments, but they did anyway. And so we kind of end on a cliffhanger here in chapter 6, because it says, at this point, everyone in the high council stared at Stephen because his face became as bright as an angel's. And this is sort of setting us up for the next chapter, where we're going to hear Stephen's sermon. So just keep this in mind as you're reading this. So far, we've heard a couple of sermons from Peter, who was an apostle. Now we're getting to Stephen, who was just kind of a regular guy. Not that Peter wasn't a regular guy either, but Stephen was a regular guy, and we see that God's grace is even on Stephen. And so this calling on the life of every disciple we're going to see it start to spread from not just the apostles, but now to this guy, Stephen. We're going to see what happens in the next chapter, what happens to Stephen. And then we're going to see what happens in chapter 8, when the message really gets out through every single believer. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of ourselves just a little bit there. For now, you're ready to read chapter 6, and we'll see you tomorrow for chapter 7.